Hello everyone, welcome to today's story. Diep was harmed by Jima's secretary. Will she be able to escape that plot and be with James? Watch until the end of the video. James stared intently at his phone screen as if waiting just a few more seconds might make Diep pick up and prove this was all just a misunderstanding. But the cold, robotic voice echoed again. The number you are calling is currently unavailable. The familiar phrase repeated over and over, drowning James in helplessness. He redialed and redialed. He lost count of how many times. All that remained was the long, empty tone, like the breath of a severed connection to someone who once felt so close. Without hesitation, James rushed outside, racing through old streets, weaving into narrow alleys where Diep once passed. Memories clashed with rising dread, clouding his mind with disoriented urgency. Near a stream, locals claimed a girl had been found unconscious, swept by the current. James's heart tightened. He arrived breathless, only to see it wasn't her. That flicker of hope extinguished instantly, leaving behind a hollow silence too loud to bear. He kept searching, wandering through the city with feverish desperation. He questioned street vendors, drivers, strangers, anyone. No one had seen a girl matching her description. Everyone just shook their heads. James began to feel something shift inside. This wasn't a delay. This wasn't someone getting lost on their way home. This was real. Diep was missing. And with every minute that passed, the fear inside him deepened, thick and suffocating, like black fog inching closer with every breath he took. It wasn't just about finding her anymore. It was about not letting the darkness of uncertainty consume him before the truth came to light. Dusk had begun to settle. James stopped at a lonely intersection, where only the sound of the wind and his weary footsteps broke the silence. His eyes were dark with exhaustion, breath shallow and unsure. That's when a young man approached, calmly introducing himself as Deanman, 27 years old. James tensed at first, but something in the man's steady gaze eased his nerves. "Have you seen a girl named Diep?" he asked. Deanman shook his head, but mentioned a nearby stream where several people had fallen in due to distraction. It wasn't confirmation, but it was something. And something was better than nothing. James rushed to the police station to report the encounter. Coincidentally, officers were interrogating two recently captured men suspected of ties to John, a figure previously linked to suspicious trades. The police offered a deal. If the two cooperated and lured John into the open, they could receive lighter sentences. James agreed without hesitation. He had nothing left to lose. The plan took shape. James would act as a buyer, requesting new goods. Once John arrived for the drop, officers would swarm and arrest him. Standing before the tactical map, James clenched his fists. This wasn't just a mission. This was a thread, thin, fragile, but possibly leading to Diep. For the first time in days, a faint glimmer of hope broke through the haze. But James couldn't shake the fear that this light might be a trick, another illusion cast by darkness. As the clock ticked down, his heart whispered one truth. This had to work. There would be no second chance. As the sting operation to trap John moved into its final phase, an unexpected discovery brought the entire investigation to a halt. Police reviewed the full communication logs between James and past suppliers. What they uncovered was alarming. Appointment times had been altered, delivery locations rerouted, and even James's calls had been secretly recorded and leaked. Someone on the inside had been manipulating everything, and that someone's name hit James like a landslide. His own secretary. The person who sat beside him in every meeting, assisted in every deal, and even stayed late planning ways to find Diep, had been the one betraying him all along. James struggled to breathe. He remembered the questions, harmless at the time, the casual inquiries about Diep's whereabouts, the gentle reassurances. Now, each memory twisted like a blade. That person had passed along Diep's movements. That person had opened the gates to danger, and never once did he suspect. Police issued an immediate summons, but the secretary had vanished. Phone disconnected, home abandoned. A silence more deafening than guilt. James sat alone in the briefing room, hands clasped, eyes burning. He had blamed John. He had prepared to face him, but now he saw it clearer than ever. The ones closest to us can cut the deepest. And worst of all, he never saw it coming. A new weight settled in his chest. This wasn't just betrayal, this was personal. And now, the hunt had two names. One for justice, one for revenge. James stood in front of Diep's old house, the place where their memories still lingered like ghosts refusing to leave. His hands trembled as he reached for the doorknob, hesitant, as if touching it might unleash everything he had locked away. Inside, time seemed frozen. A scarf still hung loosely on the back of a chair. A half-empty glass sat on the table with a faint lipstick stain clinging to its rim. The soft scent of her perfume clung to the air like a whisper from the past. But the girl who once filled this home with warmth was gone. He sank to the cold floor, elbows on knees, burying his face in his hands. Images flooded in, crashing over him. Diep, coming home from work, opening the door, only to find strangers ransacking her home. She had no warning, no time. She ran. That's all James knew. But it was enough to destroy him. If I had come back earlier, if I'd protected her, the thoughts repeated in his mind like a punishment on loop. His mother stood nearby, silent. James turned to her with red, exhausted eyes and choked on the words, "It's my fault." She didn't respond. No accusations, just silence. She walked over and placed her hand gently on his shoulder. "They chose her because I loved her," James whispered. That truth cut deeper than any betrayal. She was targeted not for who she was, but because she meant everything to him. The guilt didn't yell or break things. It settled in his chest like stone, unmoving, suffocating. He had failed her, and no justice, no revenge, no apology could erase that. Only silence remained, and the weight of guilt forever. James's mother sat quietly beside him, her gaze fixed not on the present, but on something far away. Perhaps a memory, perhaps a warning unspoken too many times. Her voice, when it came, was soft, but heavy with decades of care. "Do you remember what your father used to say?" she asked, without looking at him. James didn't answer. He said, "Love is not just about choosing someone. It's about being ready to protect them." And he warned you. Diep didn't come from our world. She turned to him, finally. "You were born into comfort, James. She wasn't. She learned to survive before she ever had a chance to feel safe. And when you brought her home that day, I saw it in her eyes. She was kind, gentle, but uncertain. She knew she didn't quite belong, but she tried. She tried for you." James lowered his gaze, tears shimmering, but not falling. If you had paid more attention, you might have seen the tension in her shoulders, the hesitation in her words. But you were blinded, not by hate, by love. And sometimes, that's more dangerous. She placed her hand over his. I'm not saying this to make you feel worse. I say it because you're still here, and that means you still have something to fight for. You can't bring her back with guilt, but you can move forward with truth. Don't let your silence become her grave. Her voice faded, but her words lingered like an echo in his chest. She wasn't condemning him, she was giving him a key to redemption. And in that quiet moment between a mother's sorrow and a son's shame, something shifted. The beginning of resolve. The first step toward atonement. James began a new journey, not of waiting, but of searching. He was done sitting still. From local markets and gas stations to narrow alleys and forgotten corners, he walked with a photo of Diep, asking everyone he passed, "Have you seen this girl?" Some glanced and shook their heads politely. Others stared for a moment before muttering, "No." A few pointed him toward abandoned houses or suggested the forest station. James followed every lead, no matter how faint. The police issued a regional alert. K-9 units, off-road vehicles, and community officers joined the effort. Still, there was no sign of Diep. Each time James returned empty-handed, another crack formed inside him. He had thought movement would save him from despair, but every step felt like chasing echoes in a maze with no exit. Back at the precinct, updates came in waves. John had been arrested. In his statement, he insisted he hadn't abducted Diep, only hired someone to scare her. The deeper wound came from within. James's secretary, the true orchestrator, was still missing. James sat motionless in the war room. Maps sprawled across the table. Search zones marked in red, growing denser by the hour. The silence among the officers was telling. No one said it aloud, but they all knew. Time was closing in. And if they didn't find something soon, Diep might never be found. The fear wasn't loud, it didn't scream. It breathed cold against James's neck. A quiet terror. The kind that grows when hope begins to run out. Evening settled slowly. The last rays of sunlight filtered through the trees, casting golden shadows across the old yard where James and Diep once sat together. James returned to that spot, the only place where their memories hadn't yet faded. He sat on the stone bench, gripping his phone tightly. It had long run out of battery, but holding it felt like holding on to a piece of her. His mother approached, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Come home, son," she said softly. James shook his head. "If she returns, I want to be the first face she sees." His eyes stayed locked on the narrow path ahead, the one Diep used to walk down every afternoon. She didn't insist. She simply laid a jacket beside him and walked away. James remained still, like a statue carved out of grief. The rustling leaves, the soft wind, and a silence that had weight, everything settled over him. He didn't know if she was alive, didn't know where she was, but he knew this. He would wait. Even if the chance was 1%, even if the odds had vanished. He didn't wait because he couldn't move on. He waited because real love, when etched deeply enough, doesn't leave. Even when the body moves forward, the heart stays behind. So James stayed. In the silence, in the absence, in the shadow of hope, waiting for someone who might never return.
James là một CEO thành đạt, Nhưng cuộc sống anh sụp đổ khi người yêu anh, Diệp, đột nhiên biến mất không dấu vết. Từ khi cuộc gọi không ai trả lời đến hành trình truy tìm vô vọng qua từng con phố, từng lời khai, James dần phát hiện ra một sự thật tàn nhẫn. Chính thư ký thân cận đã phản bội anh, đẩy Diệp vào vòng nguy hiểm. Dù John, kẻ bị nghi ngờ, đã bị bắt, Diệp vẫn biệt tâm, bị dằn vặt, đau đớn, bất lực. James chỉ còn sự lựa chọn ngồi chờ giữa kỷ niệm cũ, bóng tối, dày đặc, và anh không rời đi vì tình yêu. Thật sự đôi khi không cần hồi đáp, chỉ cần đủ sâu để đứng lại và chờ một người có thể không bao giờ quay về.